I'm Andrew Burt. I'm managing partner of BNH.ai and chief legal officer here at Immuta. So thank you for joining my virtual South by talk today. It's really, really great to be with you. And so basically, I'm going to dive right in. Today, I'm going to talk about the state of our data. I'm going to explain where exactly we are in cyberspace. I'm going to try to situate us, how we got here, and what we should do next. And I'm going to explain why, as it says up here in the slide, that the evidence actually suggests that we don't care all that much about our data, that despite everything we say and we do to keep it protected, our data remains as vulnerable as ever. And so I want to start with a recent history of just where things stand in cyberspace. And we'll start by focusing on the state of our cybersecurity. So just going back to 2013, only 7 years ago, you might remember this attack. There was a data breach that affected every single Yahoo account, one of the biggest email providers on the planet, amounting to one in almost every 2 living people. Then there was this was 2014, and one of the worst cyber attacks on a private entity by a nation state. I actually worked on this while serving in the FBI cyber division. It was a terrible example of all our vulnerabilities in cyberspace. It cost the studio tens of millions of dollars. It ground their IT systems to a halt and embarrassed executives, and a whole lot worse. And then, of course, the following year came this news. This is one of the most catastrophic breaches in history, in my view. These are the most sensitive records of all national security employees in the US government, which were hacked, including my own. By 2018, there was the Marriott hack affecting 500 million people. And just to make it clear, these are just a few headlines from the last 7 years. There are hundreds of other examples, many of which dominate 1 or 2 news cycles before our attention inevitably shifts to the next hack and it fades into our collective memory. And so our data keeps getting attacked time after time after time, and most of us forget about it. And in fact, to help illustrate this point, I want to play a little bit of a game. So I'm going to show an intrusion mapping in the next slide. It illustrates how an intruder broke into particular computers and databases. And I'd like you to guess which major breach this represents. Or better yet, you can just guess the year that this breach occurred in. So here's the mapping for one pretty complex major intrusion. You can see in the top left, the intruder moving through a series of German public utilities and universities, then through a defense contractor in Virginia in the middle here at the top, and then to a series of endpoints on the bottom portion. These are the actual victims of the attack. And they include things like national laboratories, organizations like defense contractors, and military bases as well. And so what we have here is a sophisticated series of breaches and lateral movements across a global network affecting dozens of sensitive computing locations. And this is a pretty bad breach. So here's the game. When do you think this took place? Guess just the year. And the answer is that this took place in 1986, over 30 years ago. It came from this book called The Cuckoo's Egg, one of the first accounts of a network intrusion in the early days of the internet. And I highly recommend this book to folks interested in information security. And it was actually based on a research paper you can actually just go ahead and Google and download as well. And so the point here is that at root, cybersecurity has been a problem for as long as computers have been connected. Our data has been relatively unprotected for decades. But rather than truly fix the problem, we simply connected more computers to each other, and we've gone about generating more and more data. Indeed, just 10 years after this hack, the director of the CIA at that time, George Tenet, publicly made this statement. He said this: "We are staking our future on a resource that we have not yet learned to protect." And he was making this in reference to our rapid adoption of the internet. And he was right then, and the truth is, he's right now. Not much has changed over time. It's been very clear that our data is vulnerable, it's not well protected for basically as long as computers have been widely used. And if our security is bad in the digital world, the state of our privacy is not much better either. And so I'd like to play another game to help illustrate this point. Same rules apply basically, but different theme. I'm going to show a few headlines and I'm going to ask you to guess where they're from. So starting with this is one of my favorite articles on privacy ever written. This article comes from the cover of Newsweek and is entitled, "Is Privacy Dead?" So just to start with, what year do we think this is from? I'll pause if you'd like to guess the answer. And the answer is 1970, 50 years ago. This was about the rise of digitized credit reporting agencies and the massive transactional databases that were being created to automate credit reports. People were very, very worried back then, 50 years ago, about what was considered to be big data and the rise of digital credit reporting. How about this cover? This is a Time magazine cover story entitled "The Death of Privacy." And the answer here is 1997, same problem, just addressed to a wider scope of collected data. In 1970, people were more worried about transactional data, but by the mid-1990s, 27 years later, it had become all data with a focus on geolocational data, tracking where you are in space. As you can see from this cover, which reads, "We have no secrets. Even walking down the street, people are watching your every move." Now on to this. When was this published? Should be a lot easier. This article I wrote for the New York Times in 2017, 3 years ago, with my friend and colleague Dan Geer. Dan and I also wrote a white paper called Flatlight for Stanford University, which is referenced in the description of this talk on the South by website, and we're going to come back to that white paper shortly. But Dan and my point here in this article was that all data can lead to sensitive conclusions about who we are or what we're doing. And at the current moment in time, nearly everything we do generates data, all of which can be used to infer sensitive conclusions about us through the use of techniques like advanced analytics and AI. And there was, for example, the famous case we mentioned in our article of Target inferring a teenager was pregnant and sending her coupons for maternity products just based on her shopping habits alone. And that was before her family even knew. And the story actually took place almost 10 years ago. And so this led Dan and myself to the conclusion that all data is sensitive data, that we need to protect almost all the data we generate if we're really serious about protecting our privacy. So what am I trying to get at so far with these stories and these articles? My broader point is really that we've been talking about the death of privacy for at least the last 50 years, and yet little has changed over that time. In fact, it's only gotten worse, and the same is true with security. The fact is, we've been suffering from profound security and privacy vulnerabilities for years, almost like they're a feature of our adoption of digital technology and not a bug. It's like Groundhog Day, frankly, but with terrible data protection. And in fact, our history actually makes it look like we don't think our data is worth protecting in the first place. Or so at least is what a professor by the name of Andrew Odlyzko says. Odlyzko teaches mathematics and computer science at the University of Minnesota. And almost a year ago today, he published this paper entitled "Cybersecurity is Not Very Important." And what Odlyzko argued in this paper is that our data is vulnerable. Our history in cyberspace looks the way that it does, the way that we just reviewed in those slides, because we don't actually care all that much about our data. If we did care about it, Odlyzko argues, our history would look different. Things would have changed. They would have gotten better over time. And it's actually a pretty simple argument. Scholars like Odlyzko, and there are others like him, they've looked at all the evidence and they've come to the conclusion that our main problem as a society is we simply don't care enough, that we don't believe our data is really worth protecting. And now, just as a kind of spoiler, I think this argument is terribly, miserably wrong. Our data is worth protecting for reasons that I'm going to describe shortly. But I do think there's something incredibly insightful behind arguments like this, because I think they highlight an undeniable fact, which is what I want to help us sort out today. Try as we might to protect our data, we are failing, and we've been failing for decades. And so one explanation for this failure is that we just don't care enough. That's probably the easiest and the most straightforward answer, and it's what folks like Odlyzko argue. And one further point, which I'd like to make, which I think is worth making, is that the markets where we as consumers and investors actually put our money, they actually suggest that Odlyzko is not all that wrong. And so here, for example, is a 5-year snapshot of Facebook's value through the end of last year. The company has suffered from dozens of privacy and security scandals over the last few years, more so, I think, in my view, than any other major company, certainly any other major tech company. The company's most controversial incident was the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where a consulting firm was allegedly able to use Facebook user data to manipulate the US electorate in favor of the Trump campaign. And that scandal actually spilled into public view in March of 2018, which is where that big dip occurred here in the center right of this chart, wiping away about $36 billion in market value in just a few weeks. But despite all this, Facebook's value has only continued to rise, as has its user base, which now stands at about 2.5 billion active monthly users. By May of 2018, just 2 months after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the price had already recovered, and then you can see from this chart, the price continues to go up. By the end of last year, the company was at almost its highest valuation ever, despite its history of privacy and security scandals. And so if we really do value our privacy and our security, something seems wrong here, something seems off. And in fact, the correlation between privacy failures and the market's response are so strong and so consistent that some researchers have even suggested using privacy or security violations as compelling events to buy stocks. The idea is basically to buy right when the breach occurs because the market acts like it cares about the breach, but any downgrades end up being short-term. This comes from an actual study attesting to this fact. Economists are literally advising investors to make money off of our collective inability to protect all the data we generate. And that brings us to this question, which is central to today's talk, which is what I want to help sort out. Why is our data so unprotected? What explains this history? Why does it feel like we're so lost in cyberspace? Why people like Odlyzko can argue with lots of facts to support them that we don't care about protecting our data. So I'm going to offer up a theory for why this is the case, why protecting our data seems so important to us on the one hand, but why it remains so vulnerable on the other. But before I do, I just want to take a moment to justify why I think these questions are so important to begin with. And I really want to highlight why I think the stakes are so high, why our data really is worth protecting, and why I frankly think these are some of the most critical issues we currently face as a society. And it starts with this, with what I have written up here on this slide. Fundamentally, I believe that data is power. Data is the information that drives software, and software is the exercise of power over space and time. That is fundamentally what software is about, a programmer or a few programmers telling all the computers we use what to do. And because of this, I believe that software is one of the most concentrated forms of power humans have ever invented. Indeed, software is called code really for the same reasons that law is called code. It's fundamentally an exercise of power through language by the few over the many. In law's case, it might be a few legislators telling their citizens how to behave. In software's case, it's a few programmers telling all the computers we use what to do and how to respond to their environment. And as we know from our daily lives, virtually every object we now use is in some shape or form a computer. And that means that data and software can be dangerous when used incorrectly. It means that the use of software, of data, like the creation of laws, is a huge responsibility. It means that software, in many ways, is the pure concentration of power itself. And it means that our data is inherently political. How all our data is used is inherently related to the way that power is structured in our society. There's a reason, for example, that half the world's billionaires live in Silicon Valley. Just wrap your heads around that. 1 in 2 billionaires on the planet live in the home and the birthplace of commercial computing and big data. And so I'll say it again. Data is what powers modern software, and software is the exercise of power over space and time. If we care about how power is distributed, about how our society is organized, we need to care about our data. We need to make sure it's used in accordance with our values and that it's protected. And this is actually an issue that's quite personal, or at least it should be, to everyone listening in to this talk. Our data is ultimately about how power is distributed across our society, who gets it, how much they have, and how it's used to shape our lives. And there are, of course, lots of examples of data's relationship to power, but I think it's worth highlighting just one, and perhaps the most Orwellian version. In China, this is a CCTV display from Beijing, where a facial recognition system is assigning pedestrians' identification numbers, which are displayed above each face in this picture. And so China's so-called social credit score actually tracks and monitors its citizens' data and assigns each citizen a number. And that data is called from the social networks they're a part of, whom they associate with, what they buy, where they go, everything they do online, and so much more. And the basic idea is that if you get a good number on the score, then the state and society treats you well. If you get assigned a bad number, it's harder to get a loan, to travel, and more. And so if data is inherently related to power, as I'm arguing, and all of our data is fundamentally vulnerable from a privacy and a security perspective, you'd think that we really would care about it inherently. You'd think that all our data would be much better protected. So back to the question, why has the digital world been vulnerable for as long as it's existed if what I'm saying is true, if our data is that important? Why is our data so unprotected? Now the answer, my answer, has to do with our ability to understand the value of our data. And indeed, it has to do with the way that we interact with language itself, with human languages, and with machine languages alike. And that's where, I think, surprisingly, one story of Benjamin Franklin comes in. And so Franklin was, of course, America's most senior founding father and one of our most important inventors. But it also turns out that he can help us to understand why the digital world is so important on the one hand, but also why we have such a hard time securing it on the other. So all the way back in 1768, Franklin developed an obsession with the English alphabet, with what he saw as the deficiencies and the errors in the way that the English language itself was written and spelled. Just to give you a sense, the English alphabet Franklin would write was, quote, in a wretched condition and desperately required a more natural order. And so Franklin ended up proposing a new alphabet, one that was meant to solve all the problems he saw with English. And this is what that alphabet actually looked like. He got rid of a few letters like X and C and J, and he added in some new ones which stood for other sounds like the ish symbol on the bottom left of this picture, which kind of looks like a curly H. And what motivated Franklin to study our alphabet nearly 300 years ago and to propose a new one is deeply related to the long-standing vulnerability of all our data. Indeed, Franklin's attempts help explain all the privacy and security failures we've talked about today. And my thesis really is that what motivated Franklin to study our alphabet is actually the exact same phenomenon that explains why the digital world has become so powerful today on the one hand, but also why it's so hard to control and to protect on the other. So what's the connection? That connection is language, because the truth is when we think about digital technologies, they all boil down to language. That is at the core of what software is. It is code. It's what allows the digital world to be so powerful, but also so hard to secure. And so this is an example of the same instruction, simply describing a short phrase, hello world, to be displayed on a screen in different languages. And this is meant to be a very, very simplistic example of all the different ways that digital technologies represent what it is that they do. Now, if you open up a computer, you won't actually see words or language inside, of course. You'll see something like this, but it won't look as cool. There'll be wires and silicon and plastic and maybe even lots of dust. But at root, it's language that dictates how computers behave, represented in millions of logical gates and transistors and circuit boards, just like this one. It's language and logic and words that are ultimately hidden beneath all the metal and the plastic of our computers and our digital devices, creating what to us appear as networks and social media applications and laptops and smart devices and all the smart things we use. It's language fundamentally that gives rise to all our data. And this is what makes digital technology and our data so difficult to understand and to control. They look like physical objects. They look like actual tangible things, but they're not. And this is also what makes Franklin's attempts to control the English language so instructive. Because this is the same alphabet we use today. There have been no changes to the 26 letters in the Latin alphabet for hundreds of years. And that's despite Benjamin Franklin's hard efforts, despite his genius, and despite the fact that he might have actually been right. But the reason he wasn't able to fix the inefficiencies and what he considered to be the errors in the English language is because language itself is a distributed, dynamic technology. It's a tool of communication that's in some senses internal to us. This is why linguists like Steven Pinker call language an instinct. But it's also a technology that we all share. Amongst all technologies, language, both human and machine, is unique, and that's what makes it so powerful, and also what makes it so hard to secure. And so in the early days of computers, some of the smartest minds in the world of computing actually had the exact same idea as Franklin. This is a picture of one of the first manuals for something called ALGOL, which was an early programming language, and this was version 1960. And these early computer scientists saw all these different programming languages and the many inconsistencies and inefficiencies between all these languages. And just like Franklin, they thought, what if we could build a simple language, one that was more intuitive and elegant? Maybe then we wouldn't see the types of bugs and errors that are so rampant in software. And so they set out to create a single universal programming language, which they actually called the International Algorithmic Language, and which became known as ALGOL for short. And this one language was supposed to fix all our vulnerabilities in cyberspace all the way back in 1960. But this is what they got instead. This is the cover of the premier computing magazine the following year, a cover that actually became famous in the world of early computing for depicting the Tower of Babel, but made up of different programming languages instead of bricks. In the Hebrew Bible, the Tower of Babel is the story that explains why humans speak so many different languages. And the story goes that humanity banded together to build a tower that was too tall, that almost touched the heavens. And so God split humanity up into different groups that spoke many different languages rather than just one. And I know it's hard to see, but the bricks in this tower each have a different programming language written on them. And Algol, of course, if you can see at the very top of this tower, Algol could not prevent this tower from falling, just like Franklin couldn't fix the English alphabet. Today, there are hundreds upon hundreds of different programming languages, each of them inefficient in their own way, and very little is standardized in the world of software programming. And so the first reason why we have such a hard time protecting all our data, why it's so fundamentally hard to secure, is because language itself is hard to control, and it's hard to keep free of errors and inefficiencies. It's like saying we should all spell perfectly all the time. Even though we might want to, we won't in practice. And so that was Franklin and how he illustrates that language is hard to control and secure. But there are also two other major reasons why our data is so vulnerable, each related, in my view, to the fundamental connection between language and the digital world. And together, I call these the three Fs. And the second two Fs are fiction and feedback. And so let's talk about fiction next. So it's true that software powers things like our electric grid, our airplanes, our financial system, things that are incredibly tangible and even physical. Software and the digital world are very real in that sense. As the investor Mark Andreessen famously put it, software is eating the world, and that's still very much true. But software is also more like fiction than anything else to us, at least intuitively. When we write software, when programmers use words to tell computers what to do, they're also in many senses doing this. They're creating a world out of words. They're engaging in the creation of fiction. One early programmer literally described coding as the process of creating literature. Another software pioneer once declared, I love this quote, that the programmer, like the poet, works only slightly removed from pure thought stuff. He builds his castles in the air, from air, creating by exertion of the imagination. And now, this is all well and good, but what it means from a privacy and a security perspective is that we're living in something very close to a world of imagination. And it's hard to understand how to protect that world. It's just deeply unintuitive to us how that world can be attacked, what its vulnerabilities might be, and everything that's at stake. It's one of the reasons why we might talk about data in cyberspace as if they're so important to us, but it's very hard for us to understand how cyberspace affects the real world. Our lack of action is fundamentally connected to our lack of understanding. And I want to give one tangible example of why it can be so hard to understand and to secure a fictional world. Give me 1 second to just get this playing. Okay, so this is a video produced by OpenAI. It's a nonprofit focused on AI, in which two AI agents play against each other in a game of hide and seek. And the blue team here is one agent. It's trying to hide from the red team's agent. And the red team keeps finding new ways to jump over obstacles while the blue team keeps finding new ways to hide. And now this is an example of AI iterating and competing over hundreds of thousands of games and learning from each scenario. And that's frankly how most people would describe what's going on. But think also about the programmers who built this world for these red and blue teams to live in. And what this example also tells us, what it tells me, is that we don't fully understand the world we create when we engage in the act of computer programming. OpenAI's programmers didn't realize, for example, that ramps could be used to jump over walls. The AI ended up figuring that out on its own. And so software creates something like a fictional world that we have a very hard time fully understanding and therefore fully securing. And so part of the reason why software is so hard to secure is because we engage with cyberspace like we engage with fiction. And so that's the second F, fiction. And now on to the last F for feedback. And so feedback is also known as the combination of a stimulus and a response, which together is how we humans learn about our world. When we touch a hot iron skillet, for example, as in this image, we learn that hot iron stimuli are painful to touch directly, and then we generally don't touch hot iron again. But because the digital world is so nearly fictional, because it's composed of language, because it's hard for us to see or feel any response. Put simply, cyberspace just lacks concrete feedback. We don't receive any tangible feedback that's understandable, that truly teaches us about the stakes of the digital world. And that makes it hard to learn about cyberspace in all the ways we're accustomed to learning about the physical world. for all the breaches I cited at the beginning of this talk, for example, how many people were actually affected? How many people truly felt the effects of any of these breaches? Now, chances are statistically that every single person listening in was impacted in some way, large or small, by one of the breaches I cited. Personally, I have like 3 or 4 identity theft alert programs because of them. But because of the lack of feedback, the chances are also high that these breaches alone didn't provoke much of a reaction from us or even from me. And so let's sum up where we are and the conclusions we've made so far in this talk. So to start out with, we know that our data is chronically vulnerable. We've suffered from countless breaches, and we've talked about the death of privacy for as long as the digital world has existed. Things are, we know, not good in the world of data privacy and data security. Despite this, we also understand how important our data is. It feeds software systems, which are among the purest forms of power ever invented, and which are created and maintained by the few, allowing them to exercise power over the many. Data, we learned, is another form of control. So why don't we do more to protect our data? The answer is because of the 3 F's. The language that powers all of this is hard to control, which makes it vulnerable to errors and bugs, because it's hard to understand and to grasp, and because the lack of concrete feedback makes it even harder to learn what's at stake. And this is really the key lesson. We simply don't understand what we're securing. We can't, and that's why it looks like we don't care, why some of us can examine the history of data protection and come to the conclusion that it must not be that important. The key gap here is our inability to understand the digital world and the value of our data. Our failures really arise from a failure of our understanding. And so if our data is so important, and yet our lack of understanding makes it so difficult to protect, what can we actually do to make things better? What's the alternative, in other words, to the way things are right now? And that's what I'd like to address in the last part of this talk. And one note worth highlighting is that many of the recommendations I'm going to make actually come from this paper, Flatlight, which I mentioned earlier in this talk. This is the paper that I wrote with Dan Geer that was published by Stanford. So what do I think comes next? What should we actually do to go about fixing things? Well, I think the first answer lies in trash. And specifically, one of the things that's unique about the digital world is that our data now lives forever, at least in all practical terms. And yet, one of the central features of the digital world is that we can't fully control, we can't fully understand it, and we don't get feedback from it. It's hard to intuit, and it's hard to control cyberspace. And because of that, there will be mistakes, there will be errors, and there will be inconsistencies. And so my first suggestion is that we make data and code limited. At some set point in time, it needs to be updated or thrown away like old trash. By making data and code have a limited lifespan, we'll limit the impact of all the inevitable mistakes. We'll minimize its ability to cause us harm. And here, in fact, is a quote from Dan and me. This is for an article we wrote for the Harvard Business Review based on Flatlight. And we say that anything unfixable, which really means permanent, is simply not tenable in the world of cyberspace. We argue that laws should ban this type of permanency in the digital world. Now, there are a host of other laws popping up designed to make us better at data protection, like the CCPA in California and the GDPR in the EU, all of which is a really good sign. But ultimately, in my view, these laws are not a sign that we're starting to understand the root causes of all our vulnerabilities. Most new privacy laws, quite simply, double down on old methods of protecting data, like notice and consent, which is only going to take us so far. And that's why, even with all these new and proposed privacy laws coming into place, I don't expect big changes to how our data is protected, at least not as things currently stand. So what does this mean? Well, to start with, what I'm proposing is that laws mandate how long companies and organizations can hold on to data for, all data. No data should live forever. It's dangerous to our own sense of privacy, and it's dangerous to organizations that actually care about protecting the data they gather. If they don't get rid of it, at some point, they won't be able to practically safeguard it. And the same thing should go not just with data, but with all software systems. If it plays a role in the digital world, code and data must either be updated, be able to be updated, or have a finite lifetime. But the truth is that's also just the start. I also think there are technological solutions we need to use to help build additional safeguards into the digital world. And to show you why, I want to play another game. And so this game is actually meant for a physical audience, but I think it can be just as valuable here in this virtual setting if you just pretend you're sitting in a larger room. And so here's the game. I want everyone to pick a number 1 through 4. Now, the next slide is going to have a question on it, and I want you to raise your hands when I ask you to if the answer to that question is yes, or if you happen to pick a 3. Okay, so here's the question. Who here has ever lied on their taxes? We can leave it at intentional lying. This is only true if you purposely misrepresented something about your income to owe the government less money. Now, raise your hand so everyone could theoretically see if the answer to this question is yes, or if you happen to pick a 3. So imagine we're all in the same room. Let's say there were 100 people in that room and 45 people raised their hands. This is an example of something called a PET, which stands for privacy enhancing technology. And this technique is called noise injection. And the way it works is that we couldn't know on an individual level who in our hypothetical room picked the number 3 and who actually lied on their taxes. Everyone who raised their hand would have plausible deniability, all 5 of them. And whoever actually answered yes to that question has their privacy fully protected. And at the same time, because we know that statistically only about 25% of the room should be raising their hand, we can find the approximate number of people who lied on their taxes. And so this is just meant to be illustrative, but the point is really, the broader point is that we can still extract value from our collective data while also protecting the privacy of each individual, and both at the same time. And so there's been a lot of work on pets over the last few years. This slide cites just really one of my favorite reports, my favorite examples on the subject. This came from, of all organizations, the United Nations. I'd encourage you to take a look at this report if you're interested. And these techniques for pets include things like differential privacy, federated learning, and more. And the example I just cited of noise injection is very closely related to differential privacy. So back to this question, what am I actually proposing? Well, in addition to legally mandated periods of deletion, I think we also need to encourage the use of privacy-enhancing technologies that actually help protect privacy directly. And there are a bunch of ways we can do this. Private companies can invest more in pets. Governments and regulators can incentivize their use directly by saying, for example, that organizations that do use them will have less liability as a result if something ends up going wrong. And technologies like pets can help embed technical safeguards into the digital world. You can think of them really as guardrails built into cyberspace based on the premise that we won't be able to fully understand the risks and therefore that our data need extra protection. But I also believe in addition to all of this, we suffer from a diversity problem in the technical world. The people who build and maintain cyberspace are really just too similar in outlook and in background to comprehensively address all our biggest challenges on their own. And this cartoon makes fun of the adage that to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And when applied to cyberspace, if only computer scientists and developers are building software, the digital world is going to look a certain way. Engineers tend to have a very hard time grappling with the ambiguity of privacy and legal issues, for example. And they're going to see the world, frankly, through a very specific and a relatively limited lens. Every problem is going to look like a nail. But we need to do better because cyberspace is hard to fully understand, and because it involves so many difficult issues, it's going to take a lot of different mindsets and a lot of different types of expertise to see things from multiple different perspectives to help confront all the problems we face. Put simply, we need to figure out new ways to have the right people interact with each other, to examine code and processes and data, to make sure that what we're building in the digital world actually lives up to our standards and our beliefs. Now, one solution to this problem is something we actually built at Immuta called the legal engineering team. Over the last 2 years, we built a team of lawyers who are also technologists to create compliant software, and that's worked well, and it's been one very powerful way to embed intellectual diversity into the process of creating software. This was a Fast Company profile that ran last summer about the legal engineering team, and the magazine actually just a few weeks ago named Immuta the 30th most innovative company in the world. And I think we've built a really, really amazing product using this type of expertise. But another solution, which I'm extremely excited about, is a new project I'm launching, and that's the first ever law firm jointly run by a lawyer and a data scientist. We're calling the law firm BNH.ai, incubated here at Immuta, and which I'm launching with my friend and colleague, Patrick Hall. And we're going to provide legal advice to technologists using advanced analytics and machine learning. Now, there's only one place in the country that lawyers and non-lawyers can run law firms together, and that was an exemption created in DC so lobbyists and lawyers could work together. And we'll be based in DC, and we're going to be the first to do this with lawyers, and with data scientists. And our goal is to embed legal expertise directly into the design phase of AI and advanced analytics so that we're properly mitigating all the risks we talked about today. But from the very beginning, we'll enable trust on the one hand, and we'll mitigate risk on the other. And we'll be the first group of lawyers and technologists truly working hand in hand like this in a law firm setting. So back to the question again, what am I proposing? Well, in addition to my previous recommendations, I think we need to get not just lawyers, but also privacy and security personnel, ethicists and philosophers, statisticians and developers, all of them into the early stages of software creation and data collection. We need to embed intellectual diversity into the creation of software, because engineers by themselves are not going to solve all the problems we've talked about today alone. That's not their primary skill set. And to be honest, it's not fair to them. They need help, and we need to figure out new ways to help them. So legal engineering teams are one. The new law firm, B&H.ai, is another. And I hope we'll have lots of lessons soon that we can share with the broader scientific and legal and data science communities as we get started. But the bottom line is that we need more commingling of expertise. And so I'd like to close with this slide. It's a picture of the Chesapeake Bay right here near Washington, D.C., which connects Western Maryland to the Eastern Shore, cutting across the Chesapeake Bay. When the bridge first opened, it was one of the longest bridges in the world. And as you can see, most of it is actually a suspension bridge, meaning the actual pathway is held up by ropes and cables. And what the Bay Bridge highlights for me is the difference, which I think is fundamental in the digital world, between trust on the one hand and understanding on the other. Now, I don't understand the physics of how this bridge works, just like I don't understand cyberspace because of the 3 Fs and all the reasons we talked about today. To me, it makes absolutely no sense how the tension from ropes and cables can hold up an entire bridge and all the traffic that runs across it, thousands of cars a day. I suspect that only a few people in the world truly understand the physics of how this works. And yet I drive across this bridge with my family all the time, putting, at least in theory, all our lives at risk. And the reason I do is because while I might not understand it, I trust it. I trust that it's been tested, that it works, that there's theory, there's monitoring and safeguards and guardrails, and really a whole system that went into building and maintaining it. And that's exactly what I believe is needed in the digital world, because it arises out of language, because it's so nearly fictional. There's no practical way for most of us to understand cyberspace, to truly grasp the value of our data, to meaningfully protect it on our own. This has been one of the major themes from the talk today, that it's just not possible for us to understand how and why our data is so important, because the digital world is just too complex. We can't understand it well enough to understand how to protect it on an individual level. But all that said, I do believe it's possible for us to trust that world, to trust that because our data matters, because it's so important, it is protected. And I believe it's possible for us to trust the digital world just like we trust suspension bridges. And so let me leave you with this. The next time you drive across a bridge like this, I'd like you to think about all the components that went into making it, the architects and the builders down to the screws and the metal wires and the breathtaking complexity underlying its gravity-defying structure. And I'd like you to ask yourselves, what would it take for you to feel the same way about the digital world as you do about that bridge? What would it take for you to trust that your data is protected, even if you can't understand how?